The rain had been falling since dawn, painting the small city in shades of gray. Inside a cracked classroom with faded green walls, a young teacher named Armand stood before 20 restless children, pretending not to notice the growing dampness in his shoes. His shirt, though carefully ironed, clung to him from the humidity. The ceiling fan above spun lazily, creaking like an old memory. He smiled anyway, because that's what good teachers do. They hide their hunger, their unpaid rents, and their fading dreams behind lessons of hope. Armand was known in the neighborhood as the poor teacher with the rich heart. Every month he gave half his modest salary to buy notebooks for the children who couldn't afford them. His life was simple. Wake up early, teach, tutor in the evenings, and return home to a small one-room apartment where loneliness slept beside him. He often told himself that as long as one child's future changed because of his effort, every struggle was worth it. But deep inside, the emptiness of his own unfulfilled life was beginning to echo louder each day. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel right now. This story will remind you why one act of goodness can change everything. It was a Thursday morning when everything changed. The bell had just rung for the first class when Armand noticed a little girl standing outside the classroom door. Her uniform was neat but expensive, not from this public school. She was clutching a small stuffed rabbit, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The other students stared curiously as Armand gently walked to her and knelt down. She couldn't be older than 7. Through soft sobs, she said she was lost. Her driver had dropped her at the wrong school by mistake and left, thinking it was the right one. She didn't know where to go. Armand comforted her and offered water. He didn't have much, only a single packet of biscuits he'd planned to eat for lunch, but he gave it to her anyway. She looked up at him with watery eyes and whispered, "Thank you, sir." There was something heartbreakingly familiar in that voice, as if life was trying to remind him that even in pain, innocence still had beauty. Unable to reach anyone on the number she mumbled, Armand kept the girl in the staff room until afternoon, trying to cheer her up with stories. He didn't realize that while he was telling her about fairy tales and dreams, the principal had already contacted the police, and through them, the girl's family. When the black luxury car finally pulled up outside the school gates, Armand watched as a tall, well-dressed man stepped out, his expression a mix of fear and relief. The man rushed to the girl, lifted her in his arms, and held her close. The child's sobs melted against his chest. Armand was about to step back quietly when the man looked at him. Their eyes met, one filled with quiet humility, the other with a power shaped by success and loss. "Thank you," the man said simply before walking away with his daughter. But there was something about that look, a flicker of curiosity, as if the stranger wanted to remember him. Days passed. Armand returned to his modest routine, teaching by day, tutoring by night. He thought little of the encounter, though the image of that little girl's tear-streaked face kept haunting him. Then, one evening, as he walked home through the dimly lit street, a black car slowed beside him. The window rolled down, and a familiar voice called his name. It was the same man, the father. He introduced himself as Mr. Samir Malik, a widowed CEO of a large company. He wanted to thank Armand personally for taking care of his daughter Hania that day. They went to a nearby cafe, the kind Armand had never dared to enter before. The contrast was almost painful: polished floors, the aroma of coffee he couldn't afford, and soft music that spoke of lives far richer than his own. Samir noticed his hesitation and smiled gently, ordering 2 cups of tea instead of coffee. As they talked, Armand learned that Hania had been struggling ever since her mother's death 2 years ago. The girl had stopped smiling, stopped speaking much, until that day at school. For the first time in months, she'd laughed, and she couldn't stop talking about the kind teacher with old shoes. Samir's eyes softened as he said, "You brought a smile back to my daughter's face." "I can't forget that." Armand didn't know what to say. To him, it had been nothing, just a moment of human decency. But to a father drowning in grief, it meant the world. In the weeks that followed, Samir began visiting the school quietly, bringing donations, new supplies, and sometimes standing at the back of Armand's class to watch him teach. Hanya would come along, sitting shyly among the children, finally feeling like she belonged somewhere again. Slowly, a silent bond grew between the poor teacher and the lonely widower, not built on money or status, but on shared pain and unexpected healing. Yet whispers began to rise. Other teachers gossiped. Parents questioned why a CEO was so interested in a poor schoolteacher. Armand tried to distance himself, not wanting to lose his dignity or reputation. But one day, the principal called him in and accused him of seeking favors. Humiliated and heartbroken, Armand resigned that very evening. He didn't even tell Samir. He simply disappeared, choosing silence over pity. When Samir found out days later, he was furious, not at Armand, but at the world that judged kindness through the lens of wealth. He tried to contact him, but couldn't. Meanwhile, Armand's life grew darker. Without a job, his landlord threatened eviction. Nights were long, cold, and filled with regret. Still, he prayed, not for money, but for peace. Then one morning, as he was leaving to look for another teaching position, he saw Hanya standing outside his door, holding that same stuffed rabbit. Samir was beside her. She ran to him, hugged his leg, and said, "Papa says you're my hero." Tears welled in Armand's eyes. Samir smiled gently and handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter, not of charity, but of opportunity. Samir wanted to start a foundation for underprivileged children, inspired by what he saw in Armand's classroom, and he wanted Armand to lead it. At first, Armand refused, feeling unworthy, but Samir said something that stayed with him forever. "You taught my daughter to smile again. You gave her what money couldn't buy, hope. Let me give that hope to others through you." Armand accepted, and from that day forward, his life changed in ways he could never have imagined. The foundation flourished, giving hundreds of poor children access to education, food, and love. Armand was no longer the poor teacher. He was a symbol of what kindness could create when met with compassion. Samir became his closest friend, and Hania, the little girl who once cried outside his classroom, called him her second dad. Years later, when Armand stood at a grand event celebrating the Foundation's 10th anniversary, he looked out at the smiling faces of children and whispered to himself, all it took was one act of kindness and the courage to care. Samir, sitting beside him, smiled, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd shared, born from tears, healed by faith. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let the world know that compassion still exists and one act of kindness can change a life forever. And before this story ends, here's a special request. Comment below, kindness never goes unnoticed. Because somewhere out there, a heart needs that reminder today. The audience fell silent as Armand concluded his speech, his voice trembling with gratitude. He thought of the little girl who had once walked into his life crying, and the widow who had unknowingly given his purpose back. Their pain had intertwined with his poverty, creating something more powerful than any fortune, a legacy of love. Outside, the rain began to fall again, just like that first day. But this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt cleansing, like the sky was washing away the past, blessing the man who never stopped believing in goodness. The poor teacher was poor no more, not because of wealth, but because his heart had finally found its home. And as the audience applauded, Armand closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, God, for that crying girl, for that lonely father, and for the miracle that kindness built between us."